Howdy, howdy, this is Mr. Potter. Last week, the following problem came up on my Facebook feed, and it's been confusing a lot of people. Apparently, 9 out of 10 people get this wrong, according to Facebook, if you believe that. Obviously, 1 plus 2 is 3, and most people realize that they're going to do the parentheses first. The question is, what do you do next? Some people will take the 2 times the 3. 2 times 3 is 6, and then do 6 divided by 6, and that gives us 1. Some people will take this 3 and then do 6 divided by 2, which is 3. And then 3 times 3 is 9. And so the question is, which one of these answers is correct, or is there another way that we can interpret this problem? And of course, what this comes down to is, do you believe your elementary school teacher, your middle school teacher, or your high school teacher? And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Of course, the problem with this problem is the implied mathematical multiplication here and how this 2 is treated. The question is, do we take care of the division first, or do we take care of the multiplication first? Because doing those in different orders gives us different answers, and we've received conflicting instructions on how to deal with that throughout our mathematical careers. The question is, who do we believe? So the question is, of course, my Aunt Sally is on Facebook, and she wants to know how I'm supposed to work this. Well, I remember from my algebra class that I'm supposed to take care of parentheses, then exponents, then multiplication and division, then addition and subtraction. So I've got parentheses. And of course, I'm going to put parentheses in quotations because that actually means something different than just P. And then we have exponents. That's something else that we will address in this video. And then we have this multiplication and division, but this is the bone of contention right here. Because the question is, if we put multiplication first and division second, does that mean that we take care of this first before we take care of division? And then, of course, we have this addition and subtraction that we'll have to deal with as well. Well, if I take a look at this, we have grouping symbols. I mean, it's not just all parentheses. So it's not just parentheses open and parentheses close. We also have brackets. We also have braces. And this is, of course, is what we learned in our algebra class, that we have lots of different ways to group this. And then later on, we would get more important things, like we would get a radix. So here I would have to do a times b first before I take care of the square root. I also have the idea of division. So I've got my vinculum here. That's the name of this fraction bar that divides the numerator from the denominator. And of course, I have to evaluate the numerator and evaluate the denominator before I take care of any division. But then I've also got stuff that I learned in my trig class. For example, I learned that if I have the sign of 3x, that there's a hidden parentheses here that I didn't even know existed. Because I'm not going to take the sign of 3 and then multiply that result times x. But if I have the sign of x plus 4, the question is, do I take the sign of x plus 4 in parentheses, or do I take the sign of x and then add that to 4? And this is that ambiguity that we're talking about. Mathematics is supposed to be something that has very fixed, very finite, very specific rules. But these rules kind of fail us here because under some situations we assume something, and then under other situations we assume something else. So continuing with this idea, my algebra teacher introduced the concept of a coefficient. So when I talk about 2x, we have 2 times x. Now, we've learned that I could use a simple x to mean multiplication, or I can use an asterisk to mean multiplication, or I can use a dot to mean multiplication, or I can have a number in front of a variable or a number in front of an expression to mean multiplication as well. So the question is, if I have a situation like this, which is really kind of what we're dealing with when we look at a problem as 6 divided by 2 parentheses 1 plus 2. Because this is a coefficient, does that mean that we have to handle the coefficient part first, distributing first, before we actually go on to the division? In other words, in our please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, do coefficients come before that? And of course, that leads to some other questions. Of course, here I have this ambiguity again. Do we deal with multiplication or do we deal with division first? Well, and then we also have this idea of dealing with stuff from left to right, but we have some mathematical functions like right associative. So when we look at please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, this exponent is what we call right associative, which means when I have an exponent raised to an exponential power, I in fact have to evaluate this first. So 3 to the 4th is 81, and so I'm really dealing with 2 to the 81st power, which is going to be a number with, my goodness, 24 digits long. As opposed to if I was dealing with 2 cubed to the 4th, which would really be 8 to the 4th, which is only 4,096. So the question is, am I dealing with a number that's 24 digits long, or am I dealing with 4,096? But this is a situation where mathematically we're supposed to go from right to left. Lots of confusing things here. But of course, now what happens when I'm dealing with someone like Richard Feynman, that time that I took that advanced physics course in college? Well, we often deal with formula in science like 2 radical x, and in his journals he would write that as 1 divided by 2 radical x, or 1 divided by 2 radical x. And what he means here is I'm dealing with 1 over 2 square root of x, not 1 over 2 times the square root of x. So looking at this, we have lots of different ways to interpret our original problem. Keep in mind, our original problem was 6 divided by 2 parentheses 1 plus 2. And we've seen some conflicting information in our math classes as we've gone through our math classes. And so we've seen that depending on whether 2 is a coefficient or if it's just straight multiplication, I can multiply the 2 first and get something here, 6 divided by 6, and get a 1 out of it. Or I can do the division first, 6 divided by 2 is 3, and multiply by 3 to get a 9. Both of these are perfectly reasonable answers, and it's because we're using ambiguous notation here. So the idea that this multiplication, this implied multiplication, is ambiguous means that technically both answers are correct. So this is one of those things where Facebook is spreading fake news, and the fake news is 1 the answer or is 9 the answer? And very few people realize that both can be the answer, depending on how we deal with this ambiguous state. And keep in mind, this is some of the best mathematics that Facebook has to offer. I mean, there are some really ugly problems on Facebook, because you could get a problem like this where you have this figure and this figure and this figure add up to 45, and the 4 banana group and the 4 banana group plus this figure gives me 23. And then I've got these completely inconsistent systems down here. For example, I have no idea what this clock actually represents. I have no idea what 3 bananas mean, because it's certainly not the same thing as what 4 bananas mean. And anyone who tries to tell you that if 4 bananas is 4, then 3 bananas is 3, is basically telling you the same thing, that if x is equal to 4, then y has got to be equal to 3. Just because there's 1 fewer line. And I certainly would never condone this as an algebra teacher. So I would really have to say that something like this is basically 4 equations, 6 variables, because these figures aren't the same, these figures aren't the same, and these clocks aren't the same. So you really can't solve this system of equations, even though some people will tell you you can. So, lovely, consistently inconsistent mathematics. Once again, this is Mr. Potter. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.